My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, there once was a wizard whose praxis was enough to induce epistaxis. If you would learn more, join us. We'll explore the Wizardarium of Calabraxis.
Our first segment is the Basic Crawl. The Wizardarium of Calabraxis is a 16-page adventure for the Dungeon Crawl Classics role-playing game, written and illustrated by Claytonian. The module starts with some backstory, and by backstory, I mean a very, very, very brief description of what's going on. Some ape men have stole 2 children from the village. There's also something about an ancient wizard and a race of people called the Vorbians. The next section is Maps Galore. This includes a crude sketch map of the caves by Harlai the Half-Pig Halfling. There is a map for players and virtual tabletops, and there is a keyed map for judges, which is what we call GMs in Dungeon Crawl Classics.
And right after that is the very core of the adventure. It's a 2-page spread with a small copy of the keyed map on one side, and all the room descriptions on these 2 pages, plus a table of 1d7, so you can tell it's a DCC adventure, random encounters. And those locations are 1. The guarded cave entrance. This is where the ape people are dwelling, who incidentally killed my level 0 thief with a thrown rock after he got too cocky. Then 4. The vibrating obelisk room. Now we're skipping numbers because exits and passages are also helpfully numbered throughout. 10. A round chamber with vertical scrapes lining walls and the ancient pulverized remains of a human. So one of the doors triggers a PC squishing trap. That's the clue. Number 13, a room with a window that has lozenge-shaped panes, and you can do magic stuff by shining lights through the panes onto people on the other side of that window. 14, the hall of animatronic sage statues. 15, skull shelves. If a humanoid skull or head is placed on the nearby dais, it can be asked any questions its owner would have known the answer to in life. Quote, many have horrid stories about being abducted or beheaded by bats, of which more later. Exit 16. This bridge with a large set of tiles on it goes over a huge chasm and is unsupported from below. Basically, there are pit traps all along the way, but, quote, a player can probably think of a way to test the path. 17. The Mouldering Library, home of Baxter the Bookaxe, again, of which more later. 19. The Experiment Chamber / Dungeon. This is on the other side of the lozenge window and is where prisoners / test subjects are put to be magicked. 21. A hexagonal vault containing a bored, polite but deadly guardian. And 24. A circular bedroom / lab containing an equally deadly monster, but also an intriguing pocket watch-like device.
The next part of the module is the addendum, which contains, quote, helpful procedures, details, and backstory for elucidation and in-game reference. This includes random encounter details, information about the headswapper bats, the mongrelocks, the advanced ape men, the undermutants, the defrosted Vorbians. There are visions of a time-shifted wizard, this is Calabraxis, and visions of time-shifted PCs. We have a procedure for random encounters. We have a whole section about time travel, including how the time travel device that the PCs might find works, 1d12 time travel mishaps, and stats for the time lizard monster. Next is a section about Baxter the Bookaxe. Then we have 1d12 rumors concerning the Wizardarium that locals might give to PCs over an ale. Then there's a section called The Monolith, which has psionics rules for DCC, as well as some notes about loss of emotions due to brain rewiring. We have a section about the Vault Guardian, the Vorbian agenda. There are some playtesting notes. There is a timeline of the Wizardarium going back 900 plus years BC. That's before campaign. We have an Appendix N, 1d12 random mongrelocks. And finally, the whole thing wraps up with an unadulterated map and wandering monster images. So let's talk about how we have used this module. Tom.
Well, I have played it in the Dungeon Crawl Classics RPG perhaps more than once. I'm a little hazy on that, but I'm pretty sure this is the game that got me into the OSR when I joined the author's game online. I've also run it as a one-shot for a single PC in World of Dungeons as an emergency backup pickup game. And here is where I do need to throw in the disclaimer about the lack of objectivity on my part of the review, because I am friends with Claytonian. I'm in a gaming group with him. We play Warhammer every week. And also we made a book together, which I wrote about Brazilian fantastical monsters, and he did all the pictures. So I guess what I'm saying is, Jason, please be nice to my friend Claytonian.
My experience with the module is I have only read it. Let's talk about things we liked. So, Tom, kick us off.
Let's start off just with the look of the thing. It's all full of these very fun and quite lively illustrations, which have a kind of cartoony style, I think is what people would say. But there is actually kind of, I think, a lot more work going into them than you might think. For example, the way that the illustrations and locations exactly match to the map, all that kind of thing. And proportions and action and expression are just really good and bring it all to life. And yeah, that map, it's a kind of isometric view cutaway of the caverns that form the Wizardarium, and it's really well constructed and very clear and easy to use.
The map is very, very good. Yeah, I was less enthusiastic about some of the illustrations. Like they're good, but they have that kind of like fun kind of DIY kind of OSR thing going on. But the map is so good. It's sufficiently detailed and clear, like you said. I could totally see myself using it at the table, and that's actually a pretty good segue into one of the things that I really liked about this module, which is it seems to be very, very user-friendly. You know, I think it's interesting that Claytonian has sort of purposely made the premise of the adventure, the backstory of the adventure, like very simple. And when I first read it, I was like, well, there's not much here in terms of the backstory. Like, this feels a little like phoned in, right? But the more I thought about it, you know, when I'm using these modules, I like to just kind of drop them in wherever anyway, or kind of use them like however I want anyway, without regards to whatever implied backstory that there might be in the world that the author's creating. And so I actually came away from that really appreciating this nod to how people are probably going to actually use this thing, right? This is meant to be airdropped into the middle of a campaign, right? And so it has this very basic setup, right? 8 men steal some kids. So I thought that was great. Going back to user friendliness, I also like that you get different map options, which is great. We just commented on that in the last episode, right? Of, boy, I really appreciate it when I have a map that I can show the players that does not have all the secrets and all the keyed locations like called out on it, right? And you get both in this, and so I think that's really great. And I could totally see myself just having the map on one side and the keyed location descriptions on the other, and just running this, and not a lot of flipping around pages, not a lot of like just back and forth, like just really straightforward and usable.
Yeah, and I can confirm from experience that it really does work to be dropped into a campaign. So the first time I played it, actually that was at the beginning of a campaign. It was a DCC funnel. So we had like 24 level 0 peasants going into this thing. I mean, to be honest, barely 5 of us made it into the cave past the 8 men. I mean, I fell for one of the classic DCC blunders, by the way, here, listeners, which is just because you rolled something resembling a weapon in your random equipment, that does not mean you're a tough guy. And then, yeah, so I've done it with World of Dungeons with just one player. Still just first level, but that's the thing. I think it's actually easier to survive this dungeon with fewer people because there's less bickering and kind of messing up and getting exasperated and doing stupid stuff. And all the kind of challenges are not things where the ability to deal out damage or survive it necessarily helps you all that much. So I think it's well pitched in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I will say that, just getting down to like kind of some of the nitty gritty of the module and what I liked about it, I love the head swapper bats.
They're the best.
Okay. Like when you first read head swapper bats, you're like, okay, like what is, it starts to, I don't know, like it kind of just sounds goofy in a way, right? But when you actually start to read that encounter, it's pretty great. So the head swapper bats, they are these bats that have like lamprey-like heads, right? And they swoop down, they suck onto your head, they tear your head off, and then they kind of spin it around and like leave it there in their mouth, and the head is able to still think and communicate. And so when you enter the head swapper bat's lair, you can converse with these people who are decapitated, but they're like up in the rafters, sort of disembodied, right? And it's just so ghoulish and creepy. Like, I really love it. And I like this particular quote here. When they attack, the host head is discarded and flops to the floor, where it will start to asphyxiate. Such heads are incapable of breathing or speech on their own, but if one were to blow through their neck stump, maybe they could say a few things. Love that. Just so ghoulish. So many good role-playing opportunities. I would have a lot of fun with this.
Yeah, it's so good. It's just, I think it's the best encounter in the scenario, and it's funny and hilarious and weird. But at the same time, that once someone's lost a head, it's a real horror. Oh my God, what are we going to do? Panic moment. And I'm trying to remember the details because it was quite a long time ago now. I'm pretty sure we ended up with basically a new PC because someone lost their head. But in order to save the discarded one, basically they ended up with an old head on their body that hadn't died yet. And so there was a whole kind of running thing about like how we could never remember which person we were talking to.
Nice.
And like for the rest of our adventures, they had the other head, I think. And maybe it was on backwards. No. That was a different thing. But yeah, it's like it's grisly, but because it's sort of comical, it's not too jarringly out of whack with the slightly arch comical things that will fill out the rest of the dungeon.
Yeah. No, it's super, super interesting. And I actually have a question about the kind of the tone of the dungeon a little bit later, but so maybe we put a pin in that. But at the outset though, yeah, like the head swapper bats, super fun. I also like the whole section about time travel. I thought that was really, really cool. It's almost like, I can just imagine like Claytonian like sitting there going through DCC book and saying, oh, there aren't really any specific rules or mechanics or procedures for time travel, so I'm going to write some, right? And it's like a whole subsystem for Dungeon Crawl Classics of like how to handle time travel. And I really like it. It has a lot of like really good, what seem like they would be very like dependable, reliable procedures for doing time travel in your game, as well as some very specific notes about the little watch fob thing that can cause time travel to take place in the module, right? I also think that the time travel mishaps are very, very fun. Mm-hmm. And the time lizard encounter is really badass. Like, this is a monster that is, as you fight it, like, basically there are these sort of time distortions happening around the monster as you do battle with it. And if you don't make a saving throw, you just keep repeating your actions. And so like if you failed previously, you just like rewind and fail again on your turn. Yeah. And if you succeeded last time, that doesn't necessarily matter because the time lizard learns. And so your successful action may not be as good the second time. It just sounds like a really challenging encounter, and I'm really into it.
I don't know if we messed with that time device enough to ever meet the lizard. I don't remember having to deal with it, but yeah, on the page it looks pretty good. And the ones we did encounter as well, what I like here is there are quite a few simple but effective traps, because normally I kind of hate traps. Not totally, but a bit. So I appreciate the simplicity of, for example, the chessboard bridge trap, which just says there are some pit traps, but the players will probably figure it out. And that's literally it, like someone pokes it with a stick or whatever. You just it gives us a sense of danger. This dungeon has been booby-trapped, but, I, the GM, reading this, the judge, I don't need to know which of the black or white tiles has a trap under it. Just sort of abstract that out. And similarly, the circular room, which is one of the classic kind of James Bond / Batman TV show death traps, where the ceiling descends and squishes everyone flat. When you go in there's a squished skeleton on the floor and scrape marks on the walls. It's pretty obvious what the trap is. So then, of course, the thing, right, yeah. the key thing is not, oh, I wonder what the trap is. You know what's going to happen if you trigger it. The thing is, how do we get through this room without setting it off? So it's pretty good that way. It's more ominous than just suddenly being surprised.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so let's talk about questions we had about the module. I may have missed it, but what's the deal with Harlai, the half-pig halfling? Like, I know how he became a half-pig halfling. In one of the rooms, there's this like tangram puzzle thing that you put on these window panes, and then you shine some light through it, a magical light, and it causes you to change into a half-beast person. Like, I totally get that. But their existence in the module, was Harlai just a sort of like in the margins kind of cute
Oh,
thing.
yeah. I think he's just he's a marginalia character, yeah. I think.
Okay, all right. I didn't know if there was something else going on there. Okay, so that's easy. My next question is, well, the tone. I mentioned it earlier. How was the tone of this module? Because I'm going to tell you, as presented, it's kind of goofy. But if you think about it for a little bit, if you think about the horror of some of these creatures, like the head swapper bats, for example, or the ape men, right? If you think about them for a minute, they're kind of grotesque and horrifying. But it's presented in this kind of like slightly gonzo way, which is keeping with DCC, standards, I guess. What's your thought there? How did it go, tone-wise?
Yeah, I would say largely comical is fair, and then with moments of abject horror or incompetence. And I would say when we ran it, when I played it in DCC, it was Claytonian cites Red Dwarf for the emotion draining in his Appendix N. I think, like kind of fantasy version of Red Dwarf with these kind of ordinary people bumbling around and arguing with each other. And then when I did it in World of Dungeons, when I had a sort of slightly more hyper-competent one guy kind of navigating all this, it was a bit like kind of Harry Harrison's stainless steel rat kind of thing, this sort of Raffles the amateur cracksman kind of figure. Still funny and kind of cracking jokes and stuff because you can't take it that seriously. But at the same time, it had much more of a feeling of daring do. So it can kind of, it's always going to be funny because it's got massive egg-headed Vorbians showing up and that kind of thing. But it sort of swings, I think, between kind of the pathetic aesthetic gutter snipes to, whatever you want for more competent characters and heroic guys.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, my next question, what does spoor or spoor mean? S-P-O-O-R. It's mentioned a couple times, and I cannot figure out where that word came from.
It's the... clearly you've not read enough classic era Call of Cthulhu things, because the spoor of an animal is its trail, or for hounds, its scent. The hounds pick up the spoor of the quarry, that kind of thing.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So that's why it has the random table for like artifacts you might find or just stuff they've left behind.
Oh, interesting. Okay, cool. And, well, you kind of already answered it, but did you get to play with the time travel fob very much?
I have a feeling we lost it quite quickly, but no. So within the bounds of the scenario, no. I don't think you have time because it's quite a complex device and you're going to be wary of messing with it at first. So the time travel fob watch thing is a device that extends into later play and becomes an artifact that the group's carrying around with them.
That makes sense.
And you can use it to do stuff to solve puzzles within the Wizardarium. And that's kind of the thing. It's a quite revisitable location because you'll show up, find the one kid, maybe go looking for the second kid, who incidentally never mentioned, so it could be anywhere, probably in the lower reaches.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, you probably don't have time to sort of figure out how to mess with the tangrams and stuff. But once you've gone away and you've been kind of playing with the time machine while you're camping and questing to, undo the weird thing that made you have an extra face on your back due to spell burn, then you can go, oh, we know how this works. We can go back, look at the library when it was not all moldy and empty, maybe read some, fun at what happened. And then it becomes like a place you'll go to again in order to try and find out more stuff or to, do whatever, to use the past of the Wizardarium to influence your present, maybe.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, Chain Lightning Round. This module has tons of fun little details. This was a very, very hard Chain Lightning Round to decide on. But Tom, kick us off.
Okay, I love everything about Baxter the Book Axe. He's a sentient but slightly senile talking book who is also an axe.
At one point, the party can find a crate of monocles, which is weird. And you wonder, what is this all about? Until you remember that Calabraxis in life, because of his various rituals and supplications to dark entities, his body was covered in eyes. And so, yeah, that makes sense now.
One thing that sort of I find, appealing, touching somehow, is that one of the items in the Appendix N at the back is an unknown dungeon pictured in a photo of a game being run by Gary Gygax.
Yeah, I like that too. Yeah, that's cute. Yeah. Of the Vorbians, our sort of haughty, egg-headed aliens who existed in the mountain where the dungeon is in previous centuries, we have this quote: "They will inquire about the status of the Limurcathulos Enervation, the Bethmura Brigade, and the parasites of Yan, but will not deign to give details of these ancient concerns. As they are haughty and consider themselves superior beings, the PCs will probably find an excuse to fight them."
Can confirm this usually happens. My third one then is the monolith. The kind of 2001 style monolith is described as vibrating, quote, "whenever there is a lull in game action, but definitely just before and after PCs enter the room.
And finally, one of the random Mongroloks is named Ramunan, which I assume is a reference to our friend Ramanan S. This Mongrolok has the power of ADHD inebriation, and Ramanan's a friend. I chat with him on Slack quite a bit, and the inebriation part can confirm. Checks out. Let's go to the Expert Delve. It's the Expert Delve. Tom, what are we talking about today?
In the words of the mighty Bush, come with us now on a journey through time and space. Not space. It's time travel. We're talking about time travel. Why, how, and when? Well, the answer to the last one is whenever you like. So let's ask ourselves, why would we possibly want to have time travel in our games in the first place?
I'm very interested in this because I'm going to be honest, I don't do it very often.
No, me either.
Very, very infrequently do I do time travel in my games. So yeah, we're totally set up to be experts here on this Expert Delve. But I am curious what you have to say here, because I suspect that one of the reasons why you and I both don't do it, just speaking for myself, but I'm guessing this is probably the case with you too. It's complicated, right? I mean, time travel in a role-playing game can get pretty tough to manage pretty quickly in my experience, which is why I tend to minimize the occurrences of it in my games.
Yeah, that's the thing. It can be, if your game is not about time travel, like as its central focus, then ironically, time travel can be too time consuming to really bother with. And so that's the thing. But then when I thought about this more, I realized that there are sort of ways to approach time travel like effects that are not necessarily as bad as what we're thinking of, kind of jumping back and forth, changing timelines and so on, which we'll come to in a second. But also there is another reason not to do it, which occurs to me, which is it's really sci-fi, it's science fiction, and that is going to undermine the tone of a lot of games, so you should be careful before you introduce it.
Yeah, I agree completely. So why might we want to include time travel in our game? Okay,
I mean, apart from you or at least one of the players really wants to have time travel in the game, there are a few reasons. One is it kind of will give you a new way to show the history or backstory of a thing you're doing. If we're talking about a standard fantasy game or even a modern day one, it's a way to avoid massive long handouts or rambling tales from village elders about what happened in the past. Just go and show it to them. It's fine. And another thing is to kind of give there are different kinds of fantasy, right? So we're talking about, we're often thinking about dungeon world, bog standard Tolkien-ish fantasy, which is broadly heroic but realistic. But there are things like young adult novels. YA fantasy often features teenagers or pre-teenagers hurled back into the past to have adventures or into the future. And similarly, like kind of mythic and high fantasy, like your kind of Michael Moorcocks of this world, will often have people plunging through the abysses of time and space to, adventure with the dinosaurs or the far future. And so if you want those kind of different feels, then it's a good tool to have. And of course, there's also the H.P. Lovecraft feel that informs a lot of sword and sorcery, like Conan the Barbarian, and thus by extension, any fantasy game with a barbarian in it. But, this idea that the vast reaches of time and space are channeled through weird and sorcerous powers, and those extraterrestrial things often involve vast reaches of time and the ability to send one's mind or body back and forth. So those are all kind of different subgenres of fantasy that you could be drawing on.
What I find really interesting as you're going through all of this is that time travel, like us just kind of saying, oh, let's talk about time travel, is really too simple, right? It's almost trite, because time travel as a concept in gaming, as a concept in fiction, as a concept in pop culture, encompasses so many different genres and tones and feelings and methodologies, and comparing the sort of like Lovecraft-esque, sort of notion of like time travel to, say, something a little bit lighter, like a YA novel or like, Mark Twain or something like that. These are very different concepts, right? And so I think it seems to me like what you said at the outset of like, you have to be careful with time travel because it can really affect the tone of your game is very, very important, right? Like that feels like a very important thing. And I'll tell you, when I've done it, I have inserted time travel into a bog standard Tolkien-esque fantasy game in the past, and it doesn't always work. It just doesn't always feel right. Like suddenly, I mean, it's fantasy, so it's not like quote unquote, like realistic, right? But there is a certain degree of like believability, right? And that can get shattered really quickly as soon as you introduce time travel, because time travel is it feels so big and powerful, right? And so it really, really, like, your tone of your game and the feeling of your game will just slam right up against it, right? So you have to be really careful with it, I think. But then, on the other hand, it's all about context, right? Operation Unfathomable, if you'll recall, it has that part where you can go through that door and suddenly you're like 9,000 years in the future. Remember that?
Yeah.
And that starts as something closer to a bog standard fantasy situation, although it's peppered here and there with a sort of science fantasy, weird fantasy stuff. But like you go through that door and suddenly you're in this gleaming, silver futuristic, scenario. And it's a big shift, but for some reason it works there. Well, not for some reason. It works there because in that module, you are already prepared to be thinking about science fiction ideas in your fantasy game.
Yeah, that's right. So I think probably the biggest I should do this point is if your time travel is going to help you to reinforce the themes or the tone that you want in your game. So yeah, for Operation Unfathomable, that is the kind of anything could happen sense down here, that this place that you're exploring is a meeting of all these different worlds. You've come down from the surface, things tunnel up from below, and hey, there's like another dimension that people are kind of moving in from. And I also want to mention, I'll talk a bit about kind of time travel techniques later, but I also want to cite a video game, which is, of all things, Far Cry 4, which does a great job of oddly reinforcing its mechanical tone through these sort of flashbacks. So to explain what it is, it's a kind of, it's a first-person shooter set in the modern day in the Himalayas, in a fictional country. But every so often you can find these things that let you do a weird kind of dream sequence where you travel back in time into the body of an ancestor that lived in this country thousands of years previously, who is going around in this Shangri-La dimension, sneaking, commanding a magic tiger to attack demons and shooting them with his bow. But you're using the same mechanics you were using for sneaking around with an AK-47 earlier and shooting guys at checkpoints. And it's really interesting the way it kind of uses that parallel to make you feel like you're doing something significant when you go back to the land of, tuk-tuks and pickup trucks. So I think if you can make sure that your activities in the future or past that you travel to in some way parallel the main action of your ongoing campaign, that's going to be a powerful echo that you can kind of, refer to or use to give a great sense of depth and significance to what you're doing.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. That's some high level jamming, right? But definitely worth exploring. I mean, that's pretty cool. I mean, we talk about theme all the time, so it's just part and parcel of the stuff that we talk about anyway. But I agree, like if you have some really consistent themes and motifs and stuff like that, you can draw that stuff. You can rely on that stuff to create some coherency between these two parallel dimensions in time and space. I want to say that I don't use time travel often in games, but when I do, I tend to like to explore the horror of time travel. This is partially because I like to have a horror veneer on the games I run, right? It's just what I like to do. And time travel, if handled correctly in session, can be quite horrific. My favorite sort of like time disruption thing to do is, okay, the party messes with some object or thing they're not supposed to mess with. They're in the middle of this harrowing, difficult dungeon. All this like terrible stuff is going on. And then they mess with this thing that causes a time ripple or a time disruption. And they blink out of existence. And then I cut away to that character, just one character that blinks out of existence. And I begin asking them about how the rest of their life progresses. They blink away to some other place or some other time. And I ask them about the next 40 years of their life, how they put this dungeon in the rearview mirror, how they got on with their life, how they had kids, how they did this, how they did that. And then a little bit later, I have them blink back into the dungeon in their aged form, right? And that is a stark, startling, kind of unnerving and indeed terrifying, if you think about it too long, way of handling time travel. So I think there's a way you can make time travel scary too.
Yeah, that's very good. That makes me think of there's a lot about age and aging in time travel, like the time traveler's wife as well, is kind of all that kind of being out of sync with the time of people that you know and love is quite scary. That's a good point. Actually, we're assuming in your example there that you can actually mess with the timeline or events that happen. I think that's just as an aside, I want to make sure that's an important question when you're deciding your time travel options. Can you actually do stuff when you're hopping around in time?
Right.
Or, as in Wizardarium, are you just going and looking? Which can be as bad, frankly, but it makes a big difference.
It does make a big difference. I actually think that, I mentioned during the section where we talk about stuff we like, that I really love the time travel part of this module. And that's one of the reasons why. I actually really like that Claytonian's version of time travel here is you are just, you're a shade, right? Like you're not a physical person who's like in the space. You're a shade, you're there. And in that sense, because you can't affect the real world too much, you get to have all the really good, like helpful things about time travel without a lot of the complicated things, right? So observing other times and places, kind of neatly summarizing backstory and history, just this sort of like general coolness of kind of seeing like other times and maybe seeing characters in other situations and contexts. Like you get all that fun stuff without having to like contend with the difficult parts of, okay, well now you're here, and this affects this and this affects that and butterfly effect and all the other, butterfly effect and all that other crap, right? Like you don't have to deal with any of that, right? And I think it's pretty great.
So yeah, let's talk about the ways that it can get complex. Actually, I thought I've made a list. I've made a list of like the easy ways and the hard ways, but let's talk about the complex ways first. So number one on my list of ways to make time travel complex is bookkeeping the capital Y Yet, which is the name for your personal future that comes from a time travel game that I've never played called Continuum, which is notoriously difficult to run, although some people claim it's not that bad. But the idea here is that anything you know is going to happen, you have to effectively make happen, because if you don't, then paradoxes will get you and game over. So that means stuff like, if you know that you were in New York on the 3rd of May 1984, you have to make sure that you go and do that later if it didn't already happen to you. You have to time travel to then, go to New York, be seen, whatever. But then that becomes like the whole game, kind of manipulating your own timeline to make sure you catch up with the stuff you were supposed to do. The other option to make things complex but fun is to allow changes to your own timeline. And I'll come back to the opposite of that. Now, the movie Primer is really good, but it's also quite complicated. In fact, I remember my friend Paul sitting there watching it in our flat in Beijing going, I don't want to look away because I'm enjoying how they're not treating me like an idiot, but I think if I lose concentration, I won't know what's going on at all. And that's because it's got these lots of recursive loops. I saw a diagram once. It's like 16 timelines in it, where it turns out that people have been using the time machine they built in their garage to give themselves notes for upcoming conversations in order to win arguments, which, by the way, every nerd's dream, I think. It's like it's Esprit d'Escalier, but fixed. And so, like, that's fun, but of course it's going to be all you're doing is going back and fixing your own timeline and leaving, like, helpful equipment for yourself and stuff like that.
Fun fact. Can I insert my fun fact?
Yeah, go on.
Thank you. Fun fact about Primer. I was at the very first showing of the movie Primer in Dallas, Texas. So yeah, I knew a friend of the director. What's his name? Shane something?
Shane Carruth. He did Upstream Color as well, is that
right? I haven't actually followed his work since then, but like,
that's the only one I've seen.
But I remember at the time being like, what the fuck is going on? This is a very, very difficult movie.
And also, well, film backstory aside as well, they didn't have much budget, so they shot it like there are entire scenes where one half of the conversation was filmed like years after the other half. Like, amazing.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the thing about being able to either bookkeep your personal future or go back and change your own timeline is it will probably turn comedic. And one thing that I noticed when we played Calabraxis in DCC was we started playing cat and mouse with the GM. Like, he'll say something like, well, you see, it looks like you guys, but, one of you is missing a hand and someone's wearing an eye patch. And then you start kind of trying to find ways to fulfill that without actually losing a hand or an eye. You just kind of, well, I'm going to dress as a pirate today and then we'll go back so that future echo becomes true without me having to not be able to see out of one side of my face. So, like, that's a tone thing. I think it might be hard to do the complex time traveling without it turning into that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so it's pretty apparent to me how it gets complex. How can we keep it simple? Like, how can we enjoy time travel and have it not be this complicated thing?
Okay, well, I think the number one thing that came to mind, I suddenly realized, like, when I was planning this, I was like, well, I've never really done time travel games, but that's not true, because I remembered I spent much of the latter half of the 1990s running and playing Feng Shui, which is a time travel game where you are only able to travel to certain fixed points in time that move forward at the same rate as each other. So you have the fun of time travel without it getting complicated. You walk through a magic cavern in the present day, you emerge in 1850, and if you spend 3 days in the year 1850, when you go back to 1996 Hong Kong, which it always was then, 3 days have passed there as well. So that way you don't get the opportunity to meet your future self or anything like that, because the junctures are spaced far apart. And it also has a thing, you can't change your personal timeline. So the rulebook specifically mentions, like, if you have the idea of burying, you know, a map of the place you're going to go into in past timeline so that you can find it later when you go over to this island, well, that didn't happen to you. So that map must have got lost at some point in the intervening years. You can't once something's happened to you in your personal timeline, it can't be affected later. Another one is where you just limit reuse of time travel by dangerous side effects. This is what Wizardarium does. The more you use the pocket watch, the higher the chance of a mishap and you get messed with by the time lizard. Pretty simple. But a variation on that I think is really great is from another video game, Life is Strange. And this is about a teenage girl who discovers she has this power to rewind time by like about a minute, I think. And the thing in that game is you can rewind that scene as many times as you like and kind of decide to say one thing or another to a person, make them happy or sad or angry. But eventually, you've got to choose what you're going to leave it as the permanent decision, and you've got to move on. And that really gives way more weight to your decision once you know what all the options are. Because that's the thing, you get to have your conversation play out whatever way you want, and you're still not sure what the best result was. So you just have to kind of decide. It doesn't make the decisions any easier.
Oh, I have a question. This is a side question, but I think it's important. So let's say you've come up with these rules for how time travel is going to work in your campaign, or how the rules are going to work for this particular time travel object or encounter or magic item or whatever. Do you explain to the players how it works? Do you think that's the best move? Like, if maybe it's out of character knowledge, but like, do you tell the players or do you let them figure it out?
I mean, that really depends on your game. If I was running DCC and they found the fob watch, I would just give them the toy and let them play with it and figure it out, right? That's kind of part of the joy of that sort of, well, yeah, that kind of gonzo, anything could happen DCC thing.
Funnel kind of thing, yeah.
Whereas, if I was doing the whole kind of Life is Strange thing, I would just probably say, yeah, you're right, tell them out of character, and then the character gradually figures it out. But I think it's easier just to frame it. Just tell them up front, you'll be able to do this. This is like, give them a card with the rules explanation on it. I reckon that's the way to go, yeah.
Well, I think that's why I really love running Dungeon World and similar games, because the custom moves that might govern things like time travel or like, say, astral travel. I created a whole subsystem for astral travel in Dungeon World, right? And one of the reasons why I really admired this module is because it seemed like Claytonian was solving a problem that DCC didn't solve, right? In the core rules. I'm just really into that kind of like homebrewing like thing. But what I like about it is you create these custom moves and you have to share the custom move with the players, right? So the players know how it works, right? Like they read the custom move or they have it read to them and they understand how it works, even if their characters don't. Anyway, sorry, continue. I just wanted to kind of like...
No, that's good. I've only got one more option that I was thinking of that is a simple one, which is the Quantum Leap option, aka the Far Cry 4 one, which is where you just go back and inhabit the body of someone in the past, either now whether you're actually controlling them like in Quantum Leap or whether you're just kind of seeing what happened to them and thus like we're just playing out historical events. That's like arguably not even really time travel, although but it's probably the simplest thing for when you have a particular scene that you need to have acted out in your game. That might be the way to go, just a bit of the old ancestral possession.
Yeah, that's great. Awesome. Well, is there anything else we want to say about the complexities and possibly how to simplify time travel in your game?
I mean, I would say, I think just what we said at the beginning, just think really hard before you throw it in willy-nilly, because your game will become about time travel as soon as someone can do it.
I think that's the major thing, right? That's the kind of thing that, like, if you have not played tons of role-playing games, you may not realize you're about to hit that wall, right? Like when you inject time travel into it, it really, really like affects the game a lot. So yeah, good advice. Let's go to companion adventures. Hi, listeners. I want to tell you about the Gauntlet Patreon. The Gauntlet is one of the most active, vibrant communities in tabletop role-playing games. We produce podcasts, the Codex Zine, Gauntlet Hangouts, Gauntlet Con, and more. If you love small press, independent tabletop role-playing games, the Gauntlet is for you. And you can help keep things going by pledging to our Patreon. This year, we have 4 different pledge levels for you to join at, each of which comes with a number of benefits. At the $2 level, you get early access to our actual play podcasts, including pocket-sized play, as well as a special Keeper of the Gauntlet title. At the $5 level, you also get a PDF of our monthly zine, Codex. Your name and Keeper of the Gauntlet title is listed in the back of each issue of Codex while your pledge is active. At the $6 level, you also get access to the Gauntlet Slack group, which is the heart of our community. And at the $8 level, you get early RSVP access to new game events on Gauntlet Hangouts. The $8 spots are limited based off how many early access players we think the Gauntlet Hangouts calendar can support. Every month on the 15th, we will make a small number of new $8 spots available. So if you want to play games with the Gauntlet, make sure you keep an eye on our Patreon page around that time so you can grab one of those rare spots. Finally, every member of the Gauntlet Patreon, no matter the level they pledge at, gets to attend Gauntlet Con each year for free. Gauntlet Con is our incredible online gaming convention, with over 200 game events and panels, competitions and prizes, and our bumpin' Gauntlet Con Discord server. Folks, we can't do all this awesome stuff without you, so go check out our page and please consider pledging. We're at patreon.com/gauntlet. Thanks. It's the Companion Adventures. Now, we have actually mentioned about 24 companion adventures already during the course of this episode. As well, Claytonian has a pretty fantastic Appendix N of companion adventures, so to speak, in the book itself. So I only have one thing, and that is an episode of The Twilight Zone, a classic episode of The Twilight Zone called Time Enough at Last, featuring the great Burgess Meredith. And this is the one where this bookish bank worker, Henry Bemis, who loves to read books, and he gets tormented by the people in his life because he's always reading books and they hate how much he reads books. There's a nuclear war, everything gets destroyed, but he was in the bank vault, so he's alive. He's the only person alive. And he now has all the time in the world to read all the books, and no one bothers him, right? So I really, and there's a twist that I'm not going to ruin here, but like, I really love this as maybe as inspiration for Baxter the Book Axe, because Baxter the Book Axe, his whole thing is he wants to just read books, right? Like it's repeated over and over again. Like, hey, do you like to read books? Do you have any books? Hey, I could really go for some books, right? So I kind of like the idea of like giving Baxter a sort of like Henry Bemis, Burgess Meredith kind of vibe. Cool.
Well, I've got a couple of a couple of things to recommend. One is a video recorded by Claytonian back in 2014, just before the adventure came out, which is him introducing the adventure with a printout he'd done at a local shop and talking through the adventure. And also he does some suggested NPC voices, including the infamous head swapper-bats that sound a bit like Christopher Walken. So as a game supplement that's good for time travel is Epocrypha, a book of speculative ages. That is EPOCH Riffer. That is by Skirples, and it's just a whole selection of different eras with like different weird creatures and things going on that you and your intrepid band of heroes might stumble into if they go travelling through time in a fantasy world. And finally, I have a small segment of a film recommendation, which is Forbidden Planet from 1956, featuring a confusingly not doing any jokes Leslie Nielsen. And it's a sci-fi remake of The Tempest, but there's a bit where they go and look at the Great Machine with capital letters, which was made by an ancient alien civilization. And that whole sequence, I think, is really good for the kind of Vorbian architecture, to give you an idea there. And, of course, the weird 50s synthetron soundtrack for the whole movie is pretty good as well.
There's nothing more disarming than watching Leslie Nielsen in a dramatic role. It is fucking strange. Like,
it's
you're just
weird,
like,
isn't it? Yeah.
What is going on here? Yeah. Well, listeners, that's our show. We certainly hope you enjoyed it. Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find The Gauntlet on Twitter at Gauntlet RPG. We have a website at gauntlet-rpg.com. And we are on Patreon at patreon.com/gauntlet. We would love your support there. Tom, thanks so much.
Jason, thank you. And thank you, Editor Paul. You do the hardest work of all.
You're really into rhymes today, huh?
That one was unintentional.
And thank you, listeners. Take care.
Bye.